Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all areas of life, and with lockdown light on the cards for at least another 6 months, further consequences will be felt in the UK and around the world.
This being the ITPro Podcast, however, we're taking the opportunity to look at the tech ups and downs over the past 6 months and to speculate a bit on the road ahead. Joining us this week is a voice that will be familiar to many listeners, Keumars Afifi-Sabet, staff writer at ITPro and occasional co-host of this very podcast. Keumars, welcome.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Adam. It's good to be back with my guest hat on.
So before we get into the specifics, overall, would you say that tech has done well or badly during the crisis so far?
I would say overall tech has done very well during the crisis. There are some companies that have done better than others because their services lend themselves way better to actually make more of a success out of what they sell. So, for example, companies like Zoom have done exceptionally well. But on the whole, it's a bit more nuanced than that. There are some companies in the sector that haven't really done as well as they would have hoped. So companies that rely on manufacturing goods, for example. But when you look at the wider economy, not just the sector in isolation, there are some industries that have just fallen off a cliff. I mean, travel, for example, and I know the arts industry is really, really struggling. So relatively speaking, it's difficult to not say that tech has done well on the whole.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I know that most companies don't want to talk about having, done well off the back of this because nobody wants to look like they're, profiting off misfortune. But yeah, I mean, tech has just been so vital to all of this. It's underpinned the economy being able to carry on at all. And even in the sort of entertainment industry, especially sort of stand-up comedians have shifted towards doing things online, which even 10, 15 years ago would have just been unthinkable. This whole thing would have been even more of a disaster economically than it has been.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, can you imagine the state that we'd be in if we didn't have tools like Zoom and Slack, and hell, even on a really basic level, kind of cloud file sharing services and ready access to email? Offices would have completely shut down. Entire companies would have been basically unable to function. And yeah, the economy would have ground to a halt even more than it already did. And I think the value of tech in helping us kind of carry on with even some vague semblance of normality really can't be overstated.
I think also, we have to acknowledge what we're up to right here, right now, like the three of us. This is, sort of 21st century, radio. It's a new evolution of radio, if you like. And the three of us are sitting scattered across the country, being able to produce a sort of radio show in a way that wouldn't have been possible, just a few years ago.
Yeah, and I think the infrastructure we have in place now, we're almost really lucky that we have it at this point, and the crisis has happened now, as against even, I'd say, maybe 2-3 years ago. I don't know about you guys, but my internet isn't great now, but it definitely wasn't any better back then. And I suppose with all the applications and services we also have on top of that, a lot of companies are really well placed to continue as normal. And I'm not sure they would have been able to not very long ago.
And you hit on something important there, applications and services. Really, cloud computing, it's one of the technologies that's really come into its own over the past 6 months and, will continue to over the next 6 as well. I don't know how much sort of progress, I guess, we're going to see in this area, but at least even as we are now, you mentioned Zoom, the cloud has, really come into its own, really shown that it can enable business in a way that I think probably a lot of maybe smaller companies, a lot of more traditional organisations perhaps hadn't really thought about.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because cloud technology has been around for a little while, but the scale of adoption has been nowhere near the kind of scale we've seen over the last 6 months, especially. And I think there are several trends that have already existed. So companies like remote working, for example, companies have already been doing this for ages. Some anyway. And I know, I mean, our company's been doing it for a little while. Not as much as it is now due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but, 1 day a week, 2 days a week, that kind of thing. But now these kind of this forward-thinking approach to the structure of the workplace and so on, the ease of access of so many services, we've almost been forced into this position, and it's one that I think a lot of businesses have embraced quite well.
So I think that cloud development in particular is really going to come to the forefront even more in the next couple of months than it has already. I think as you guys have mentioned, remote working is now a huge part of, the business norm, and companies are going to need to start embracing that with more digital services, more applications, where traditionally they may have relied on in-person trading and face-to-face communications and all of that kind of stuff. They now can't afford to. So I think a lot of them are going to have to, I think everyone really is going to have to invest much more heavily in cloud services and cloud applications and building their own services on top of that, which is going to require a lot of development work and a lot of skills within those companies to maintain and operate those services.
Yeah, I mean, keeping in mind sort of office-based businesses for now, because I think we can come to other sectors in just a second. Do you think that the requirements, building a COVID-secure workplace has been advisory until now, but it's going to be a legal requirement? And so do you think that that is going to have an effect in growing cloud, Adam?
Absolutely, because I think fundamentally the most COVID secure workplace is a workplace with no workers in it. And, the advice, certainly the current advice, is to work from home if you can. And I think a lot of organizations, which I think we'll probably touch on later on in this episode, a lot of organizations are going to be seriously weighing up the value of investing in all of the equipment that they will need to make their workplaces quote unquote COVID secure, in terms of screens and potentially relaying out floor plans to embrace social distancing and having kind of temperature check stations and check-ins and all of this kind of stuff, versus just everyone working from home for the foreseeable future.
So, I think the three of us, probably everyone else agrees that the cloud is very important, has sort of facilitated a continuation of the economy here. But as our colleague Bobby Hellard recently wrote about, you still need the hardware to be able to access the cloud. So how have hardware needs changed? Has this put extra pressure on businesses, even if they're not, for example, paying rent anymore?
I think it has. I think a lot of businesses who previously might not have supplied their employees with devices, for example, are now in a position where, I think going back to March, April kind of time, where office-based businesses were sending their employees home, they now had to suddenly fork out for machines, and not just one or two, but machines for the entire team. And not every company, not every team has the budget necessarily to do this. I mean, there are financial pressures and so on. So I know an example, I'm not going to name names, but I know an example of one company that has only purchased machines for some of their team, and others are having to work on their personal devices, which they have their personal devices at hand, but it's not necessarily the smartest and most secure way of going about continuity, I don't think.
I mean, businesses have been kind of embracing bring your own device to a certain extent or another for a long time, but this is a whole nother level. A lot of companies have still up till now been working on desktop devices. They've been working with traditional tower PCs, maybe thin clients, But when you're sending everybody home, that's not always practical for people to use. You can't expect them to cart an entire desktop and monitor and everything else back to their residence and install it somewhere where it's going to be convenient for them to use. So in those kind of situations, you need a laptop. And, certainly at the start of lockdown, back in kind of Q1, Q2 kind of time, there just weren't any available because everyone
That's true.
scrambled to get set up. So a lot of organizations are only just now, getting those deployments and those rollouts sorted. And you also have to remember, once you've purchased the laptop itself, you still need to secure it. You still need to image it with all of the kind of licensed software that you need as a business in order to be able to function. You need to make sure that you've got the monitoring and management software in place to be able to effectively keep track of it. It's a huge, huge operation. And the fact that so many IT departments were able to, to do that in such a short space of time, frankly, I think is heroic, but it's very much still an ongoing effort.
We're going to take a short ad break now, but when we come back, we'll be talking about how non-office-based businesses have fared, new apps that have sprung up, and the rocky experience of the public sector.
See you after the break. Welcome back. Now, we've already spoken about software in terms of cloud apps and services, but we should also talk about the software in terms of the contact tracing apps that are being rolled out to help contain the spread of COVID-19. Now, England and Wales's own contact tracing app has just gone live this week amid some small controversy and no small amount of delays. But how has software been used in this way to kind of support healthcare organisations?
Well, I've been part of the King's College COVID symptoms study for a while now, for months and months. And I think that that's been sort of quite helpful. You do feel like you're doing something. And in the absence of any other apps, it was kind of handy. You kind of had a vague idea of how many people were ill in your area before some of that was coming through from the government. And we'll leave a link to how to sign up for the study in the show notes, should you wish to also do that. But yeah, like you say, a big part of this whole thing has been government track and trace apps. I read something the other day about how key this has been, just a big track and trace system in Mongolia, of all places, and really keeping COVID under control there and the importance of it. And we will also leave a link to that story in the show notes. Over here,
it's been, frankly, a bit of a disaster, if we're being honest. The government went back and forth as to whether or not they were going to use the mobile contact tracing API co-developed by Apple and Google. They said they were going to use it, and then they decided, no, we're going to build our own. And then after that, frankly, didn't work in the way that they were expecting it to. They eventually went back and went, oh, no, we're going to use the Apple and Google API after all. Now, this isn't without its problems either. It has been pointed out by a number of kind of commentators that the Apple and Google API only works with phones, up to a certain point. So any iPhone that is running on anything lower than iOS 13.5 won't be able to use the contact tracing app because it doesn't have the correct API support, which means there are a lot of people within the UK who will not be able to use this.
Yeah, those are your iPhone 6s, your iPhone SEs. I mean, I am a former iPhone SE owner as of not very long ago, so if I decided to stick with it, which I could have done, that would be me excluded, as well as I don't know what the number is, but I imagine too many people.
Yeah, and particularly lower income households. Yeah, and people like me who are kind of, and presumably yourself, Keumars, who are rather sort of frugal. I hold on to stuff until it dies, like completely, it just like stops working. So there's genuine concerns about this, But as our public sector correspondent, would you take us through sort of what happened in England and Wales and also Northern Ireland and Scotland, because healthcare is devolved in those two countries?
Yeah, so that's right. So they would have been on their own decision-making track. And at the time, things were looking really promising because obviously the app, the way it worked, made sense. It wouldn't necessarily keep anyone's personal data in an accessible format. So the privacy conscious, and I would count myself in that bracket, would be encouraged to download it as well. And it seemed as if at the start of lockdown, where the pandemic was starting to actually take shape in the UK, that, okay, we had this tool that would really help us over the next months, because the development time that would have had to gone into it, maybe it wouldn't have taken very long because the API toolkit already existed and so on and so on. But then the government intervened and decided it didn't want to go down that road. It wanted to have access to all the contacts and location data. So it said, thanks, but no thanks, we're going to develop our own app. And we all know how that went.
Yeah, I do like that they kind of went, we're going to use the Isle of Wight as a test bed. And it just feels like something like those guys who were kind of just offshore a little bit, we're going to test it on them, and then we'll see if we can roll it out to the rest of England and Wales. And yeah, it's that seemed like kind of wrong. And B, sort of failed spectacularly as well, because a lot of this is built on trust, like you say, security conscious, privacy conscious people,
of course,
are not going to be kind of like, yeah, sure, here's all my data, and kind of without any clear lines of use. And I even saw this morning Jim Killock of the Open Rights Group has welcomed the fact that in England and Wales there has been the decision made to go for the Google Apple API. And I think, am I right in thinking that in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, that was what they went with, like off the bat? They didn't try and, I don't know, carry out some kind of experiment on the Isle of Lewis or whatever first.
So exactly, I think that they looked at this API and went, yeah, that looks good to us, and they kind of went on their development journeys. And the Northern Ireland app came out in July, I believe, and Scotland's own app came out in early September. As of the 11th of September, I think it came out on the 10th. As of the 11th, it was downloaded 600,000 times, which is, for a day, for Scotland's population, that's fairly encouraging, and hopefully that increases. And hopefully as many people as possible download the newly released NHS app, which I got on my phone last night. It's good, it works. Obviously there are limitations, but at least, it wasn't really fundamentally developed by the government from the ground up. So, that it's not going to be as bad as the one they were developing, because of course the one on the Isle of Wight, according to reports, had several glitches. It had several security issues. I think there was one problem where the app needed to be open, otherwise the Bluetooth contacts weren't being established. Obviously, I can't confirm that. These are all according to external reports. But yeah, no, the whole situation has just been a bit of a shambles, to the extent where I remember a Department for Health and Social Care spokesperson was essentially saying that they weren't working on a parallel app, and this is while the Isle of Wight app looked to be abandoned. So it was all very... It's kind of typical of the way the government has handled much of the pandemic.
It's a hell of a way to sweep everything under the carpet. Kind of like, well, we've got this test bed that doesn't exist. So moving on from perhaps the shambles that has been the contact tracing apps in England and Wales in particular, what do we think are, say, the biggest tech triumphs that have happened?
So on the flip side of the COVID-19 contact tracing app, I actually think much of the public sector has been doing really, really good stuff during the pandemic, slightly under the radar. We've all been having conversations with different parties during the pandemic, and I have spoken to a few different organisations as well. The Rail Delivery Group, for example, Staffordshire University I've been speaking with, and I also sat in on a Tech UK public sector panel the week before last, and in which there was a pretty strong consensus from all of these different conversations that were being had, and that consensus was digital transformation in the public sector and development and progress has actually accelerated during the pandemic. It hasn't actually held anything back. COVID-19, if anything, has made things happen quicker, more efficiently, and I suppose many of these organisations have almost been forced into that position because of the nature of public services. I mean, people need public services, and one of the only ways to deliver them now is digitally.
And that's happened across the board as well. One of the recurring, I guess, memes that keeps popping up on social media, on LinkedIn in particular, is that thing of, what's been the biggest driver of digital transformation within your organization? Board, CIO, COVID-19. But it is true. Coronavirus has massively accelerated digital transformation and the adoption of all of the things we've talked about already. So, device refreshes, cloud applications and services, collaboration platforms, increased software development, across the board, it has kickstarted IT investment and IT modernization in a way that CIOs have been kind of praying for years. It's the best use case you could ask for as a CIO for saying, no, we really do need IT investment and we need all of these services because they are now not just, efficiency drivers, they are genuine operational necessities now. And I think it's really made a lot of organizations wake up at, board level to the value that IT can offer. And, it's really pulling its weight at the moment.
And I think, crises do tend to spur innovation, and you're talking about board level and CIOs, but for smaller businesses, I have seen quite a lot of innovation in this kind of area as well. For example, I think I may have spoken about this before, either on the podcast or in general, but a greengrocer local to me started doing deliveries. They were really pushing that. They've clubbed together with a butcher, with just delivering kind of everyday essentials, as they put it, washing up liquid and stuff, and they'll deliver all of that to you. And that's obviously a small business side of things.
Have they also teamed up with a baker and a candlestick maker?
Actually, they have. They've teamed up with a baker.
Oh no, you just need one for the full set. That's
I was going to say, I'm not sure we have a candlestick maker here, but no candlesticks so far. But also, other local businesses that are promoting each other through social media, that kind of thing. And I think that this has been quite a big change. And even if they were doing that kind of thing before, the collaboration between small businesses, but also the awareness that this is something that you can do to support your local businesses as well, is pretty great. You've also got bigger organisations like, Deliveroo and Uber Eats and whatever, who are able to deliver food from either local eateries or larger chains such as, for example, Pret. Definitely the conversation topic of the moment. So yeah, I think that's quite heartening as well, and is another possible element of what's going to remain even after we've overcome this crisis.
It's also interesting to note that Facebook is doling out, I think, 100 million in grants to small businesses to help keep them going during the kind of COVID-19 instability, which is a little unexpected and, very, very laudable. Obviously they have a slight vested interest in keeping small businesses afloat and, giving them more money to play with because, as you mentioned, social media marketing and awareness is one thing that a lot of small businesses have been relying on, and Facebook is no doubt hoping that they're going to funnel some of that grant back into its advertising and marketing arms. But the fact remains, Facebook is doling out, a fairly substantial package to small businesses in a way that, the government in a lot of cases maybe isn't.
Yeah, there's a big difference between a grant and a loan, for example.
Well,
Definitely.
exactly.
So if each of us could choose one thing that we think is going to happen over the next 6 months, what do we think it would be? Keumars, you go first.
Sure. So I think that a lot of companies in the previous 6 months have maybe some for the first time started to come to terms with the idea of remote working and the tech that might be involved and so on. But I think over the next 6 months we might to see more of the culture around that honed in and reformed and improved. So I think a lot of companies might now have the infrastructure in place, but with remote working expected to continue for some time, and I believe as long as the virus is in our midst, to some extent, I think a lot of these companies will now start building support programs around that, looking out for particular specific employees that remote working might not necessarily work for as much. I feel that company culture on the whole in the UK will improve, or at least I hope it does.
Yeah, I think that a lot of organisations who were perhaps trying to wait out the lockdowns and kind of embracing remote working and all the trappings thereof as much as they had to in order to keep business going, but kind of really just treading water until they could get back into the office, I think a lot of them now are going to realise, actually, this is something that we're going to have to deal with head on and implement on a long-term basis. So I think a lot of companies are going to be reorganizing how they think about remote working, how they think about office space, how they think about flexible working hours. All of that kind of stuff, I think, is going to be radically reinvented over the next 6 to 12 months.
I think that we could see a dramatic change in how city centres and how suburbs look. I think that we're going to go back more to not only there being local businesses around where people live, but them actually being used properly, being more profitable, not seeing the going and coming of little businesses. And within city centres, organisations that really thrived on having workers come by, sandwich shops, that kind of thing, they are going to struggle. But I think we'll see more of a re-angling towards maybe destination shopping, towards greater tourism, towards greater leisure when all of that kind of stuff comes back, which I truly believe it will. But I think we're going to see a re-angling of what is wherever it is. That doesn't have a tech angle particularly, but that's what I think is going to happen.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Keumars, for joining us as our guest.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Jamie. I thought it was a great discussion.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website, itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on your podcatcher of choice. And if you can leave us a rating and a review, that would be really great, as it helps your colleagues and peers discover us.
We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.